And hello again, everybody. Welcome to the Keith Costas podcast. I'm Bob Ramsey, your host, and of course, the star of the show, Keith Costas from MLB Network. He is their analyst. And Keith, it's good to see you. What a crazy week since we last spoke. Nobody wants to win a wild card berth. Nobody.
Yeah, that's absolutely right, Rammer. We talked a little NL last week, and this week focusing on the AL. You hit the nail on the head. No one wants to run away with it. And I mean, maybe prisoner of the moment a little bit here, but I feel like more than any other season in recent memory, we've seen this kind of ping-ponging with not just, it's one thing for the Cubs to, rise up and overachieve for the first half of the season and then fade away. But I'm talking about teams that had real World Series aspirations and World Series caliber rosters looking like juggernauts one week and then, being completely inept the next. I mean, we've seen it all over the place. The Dodgers have even done it as good as they've been this year. The Padres have certainly done it. And now on the American side, specifically in the American League East, the Yankees and the Red Sox dealing with a myriad of issues that have them trending in the wrong direction in the standings. So it's been a wild series in that, or a wild season in that respect. And the last couple of weeks are certainly no exception.
Let's talk about two of those teams. And I know we want to get to the Subway Series in a moment. Here in St. Louis watching the Dodgers, it's funny, of all the great players they have, and we've talked ad nauseum about their roster, isn't it funny that they've scuffled a little bit without A.J. Pollock? Pollock has been the guy that's sort of that unsung guy, hitting fifth and sixth every night. But since he went down with a hammy, could be coincidence, they've just been decent, not the juggernaut, to use your word.
Yeah, and that goes back to the conversation we've had a couple times when they made those moves at the deadline. It was who was the odd man out, and at that point we were talking, it has to be Bellinger because Pollock has just been so good you can't take him out of the lineup. And you go back to when they got A.J. Pollock. Now, obviously, the Dodgers have spent all kinds of money, be it extending their players or spending prospect capital to get players. But you just look strictly in the free agent market at that time. The deal that they gave to Pollock, it wasn't a monster deal, but by Andrew Friedman's standards, that was the biggest free agent deal he's ever given out to a position player, Tampa or Los Angeles. So that just kind of tells you about the way they go about evaluating players, and something about Pollock piqued their interest that they kind of went outside of the box in terms of how they usually stack their roster up on the position player side. And they identified him as a guy that could really help. And he's come through in a major way this season before the hamstring injury, like you mentioned, but he's been one of the better hitters in the league in the second half. And, you mentioned Pollock. Chris Taylor's another guy who all year has kind of helped drive that train for them that doesn't have the star power. So yeah, we can talk about the Betts and the Turner addition and obviously the pitching that they have. And if Bellinger ever gets it back on track, what a bonus to have a former MVP like that at the bottom of the lineup or even off the bench. But yeah, it does seem that the Pollocks and the Chris Taylors of the world are still kind of the straw that stirs the drink out there, or at least separates them from a 90-95, typical first place kind of team to the 110 win type of aspirations that they legitimately have had the last couple of years.
Let's go to the other coast. Subway Series starts tomorrow. Everybody on the East Coast and really everybody in baseball will be watching. By my estimation, the Mets are at 500 now. They're hanging on by their fingernails, and really they've lost a couple of fingernails. They've got, in my view, they can't hang on. They've got to make up ground this weekend. The Yankees, after being great, are being terrible. You alluded to that in your opening comments. When they got Rizzo and Gallo, it almost seemed like they had too much. How are they going to do this? And I don't think they can figure out how to do it.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting when you look at the Yankees because I think everyone agreed before the trade deadline with those two guys that you mentioned. They were just too right-handed. I think only the Blue Jays had a higher percentage of their at-bats from right-handed hitters. That's a different proposition, though, when you've got a lineup that's humming on all cylinders like the Blue Jays lineup has for the majority of the season. They've had their moments, too, just like everybody else that we talked about. But for the most part, that's been a very potent lineup. So I think the conventional wisdom was correct that the Yankees needed to get a little bit more balance, but they swung in the other direction and they got guys that they just kind of tried to shoehorn into the lineup. Now, Rizzo, I thought was a perfect fit for them. Gallo, I mean, hindsight's 2020. It certainly hasn't played out well for them, but you look at what they were doing in the first part of the second half of the season. They went from dead last in the league in stolen bases to, for the first month or so after the break, they were first in the majors in stolen bases. So they when they were up against it before the trade deadline, when they had to fill in those COVID spots and guys were banged up and nicked up and they were calling up all these kind of 4A players that no one had ever heard of, they were having to manufacture offense and they were having to start to play a little bit differently. I'm not saying that's what keyed their 13-game winning streak or anything like that. Most obvious answer is correct. It's the Stantons and the Judges and all of them getting going together. That's what had them really rolling. But being able to play that small ball and kind of diversifying the style just as much as diversifying the left-right makeup of the lineup, I thought had a big factor in them kind of getting on the roll that they did. And they seem to have gotten away from that in the last couple of weeks. Only 2 stolen bases in this little 12-game skid that they're on right now. So they went from completely changing the script to back to that kind of station-to-station baseball that they've been playing for the last couple of years.
I'm certain everybody in New York, and in particular the Yankees organization, is interested in how I think they should play it the last 3 weeks. You can pass that along if you want. Unless it's an obvious, huge individual advantage, I don't think you can play Gallo every day like they've been trying to do. I think I just think, and Stanton's got to play outfield. Can you keep him healthy? Can you keep his legs good? In one of the corner spots the rest of the way. I think they're at a real danger point. Could be wrong. Maybe Gallo hits 500 the rest of the month, but I don't see it.
Yeah, it is somewhat ironic when you look at the kind of makeup of those two players you mentioned, Stanton and Gallo. You would think that Gallo's the one that, regardless of what the batting average or the production looks like, you're going to keep him in the lineup because he's going to draw walks. He's a Gold Glove caliber defender. He's been more durable than Stanton, but you fast forward a couple weeks in pinstripes, and it's the exact opposite. I mean, the idea that Joey Gallo might have to sit so Giancarlo Stanton can play the outfield was almost unfathomable a month ago. Yep. Even if you said Joey Gallo was not going to be close to 200, you'd still figure he's going to take his walks, he's going to hit his homers, and he's going to play a good defensive outfield. And he's just so far gone, like you said. I mean, his walk rate basically is the same that it was in Texas, but his strikeout rate, even by his standards, is just through the roof. I mean, he's striking out in like 45% of his plate appearances with the Yankees, even for a guy like him that can pop 2 or 3 home runs on any given night. It's just not sustainable. And when you look at how the rest of the lineup is performing, I mean, they're getting absolutely nothing right now. I mean, a week is a blip in the blip of time in the bigger scheme of things in the baseball world, but you just look at this little 5-game losing streak that they're on in this series with the Blue Jays in particular. They have 1 extra base hit in this first 3 games, this 4-game set with the Blue Jays, and it's Brett Gardner. I mean, the guy that, again, same kind of deal. Like, we're talking about a player in Brett Gardner who halfway through the season, everyone was basically saying, great career, hard to watch it end like this. The Yankees made a mistake bringing him back. He has no place on the roster. And now he's the only guy that's provided any kind of power in the last 72 hours for them with a 3-run homer in last night's game. It's just hard to figure how that many good hitters don't just run into a couple balls over the course of a week or so, but they just haven't.
Well, speaking of running into balls, and they're not running into balls, they're hammering baseballs, and they have all year. Of course, 9-1 in their last 10, 7 in a row. How do you not bet on the Blue Jays taking over?
Yeah, especially with the way it's playing out with them going head-to-head and having a chance to just directly overtake the Yankees in this 4-game set. I mean, you watch the post-game show up here in New York of the Yankees game last night, and it was a big-time game. I mean, the thought that they could have at least given themselves the breathing room to say that we're going to get out of this series with at least a 1.5 cushion over the Blue Jays, and now they go into this last game with a chance for Toronto to cut it to just a half game for that second wild card spot if they can complete the sweep. That's a tough little bit of karma for the Yankees, or a positive bit of karma, I guess, for the Blue Jays when you look at just the head-to-head matchups there. And you said it. I mean, we've talked all year about the MVP race, and Ohtani's running away with the thing. Obviously, it's the same as when he won Rookie of the Year. I mean, Miguel Andujar might have had a better season that year, but it's just so unprecedented what he's done that it doesn't matter if Vlad Guerrero's had a better season at the plate. Ohtani's obviously the MVP. But that said, Vlad he's got a chance to really put the team on his back here down the stretch. He's still swinging it as well as anybody. Had a big home run last night that was just absolutely pulverized. So, yeah, the Blue Jays are about as scary of a team as you could run into right now. I mean, Marcus Simeon's having an MVP caliber year. They've got guys up. Yeah, Simeon, if you like the Brandon Crawfords of the world in the National League, you must love Simeon in the American League. Yeah, that seems like a Rammer kind of player, and he's having a hell of a year. Will be interesting to see what happens with him having changed positions if someone wants to sign him to play shortstop in the offseason, if he sticks at second. That's a conversation for another day. But yeah, that Blue Jays team is locked and loaded, and I don't think anybody wants to see them down the stretch, especially with those two teams in their own division not being able to maintain the way they played the first 80% of the season or so with Boston and New York.
You being located in New York, I don't want to make the area even more depressed. I would, if I had a bookie, I would maybe call him. Wouldn't it be interesting, maybe even fun, depending on your zip code, if the Blue Jays and the Mariners were your two wild card teams?
That would be fantastic. And I'm glad you brought up Seattle. I would have forgotten to bring them up probably, but they're right there. And it's the longest postseason drought in North American team sports right now. You got to go all the way back to 2001 when they had those 116 wins and couldn't get over the hump in the postseason to the last time they played into October. And I think we've just become accustomed, looking at the roster. It's not as talented of a roster, but here they are. They're still right in the mix. B, you look at what they did at the trade deadline. I mean, they basically the whole team has been based around one-run games this year for Seattle. They've killed it in these close games, and they trade away their closer, and they had a mini mutiny on their hands. So, I mean, you're sitting there thinking that, they're kind of an afterthought. They'll fade away, but they've been in this spot before, and they've always kind of faded before this kind of 3-week left point in the season. They've made it maybe to mid-August or late August or on a handful of occasions into deep September with at least a mathematical chance of making the postseason, but it just feels like they've played steadier and hung around more this year as opposed to overachieved in past years and then kind of come back to the pack. They've done the opposite of what we were talking about before. They've just hung around, and all these other teams have come back to them, and we'll see how it plays out these last few weeks.
So give me, going back to being New York centric, and give us in flyover country what we think about this. What's the feel in New York about the Subway Series in particular?
Well, I think you just look at the last couple of weeks, like we talked about, they're obviously trending in the wrong direction. If you asked me 48 hours ago, I would have said the Yankees are plummeting, which they still are, and the Mets are at least keeping their hopes alive. They'd won, I think it was 7-9, but these last couple of days, a couple really brutal walk-off losses down in Miami. And I know we got into the schedule a little bit last week and kind of talked about how that can be a fool's errand trying to stack up strength of schedule. Right. That said, these Marlins games are the last games. They have one more series against the Marlins, the Mets, that is. But other than that, they're playing all contenders the rest of the way. So they could not afford to lose this series, let alone, pick up a couple losses in crippling fashion. So the Mets are coming in limping a little bit too, but yeah, I think that the tone up here in New York is kind of what it always is with the Subway Series. It's a big brother, little brother thing, and I think Yankee fans are looking at this and saying, "All right, it's time to put a stop to this. If we're gonna hold on to these playoff chances, it starts this weekend. And what better way than to beat up on the little brother who's also kind of reeling a little bit right now?" So I think that's always sort of the tone of the Subway Series, but it has much broader implications beyond just the bragging rights in the stands this time, which is not always the case. One
quick note. On the National League wildcard standings, the Cardinals and the Reds play this weekend, and everybody wants to call it a showdown. Unless one of the other sweeps, it probably doesn't make or break. Somebody will win two. If somebody sweeps, okay, now it's a different discussion. But this is one of those things that teams are beating each other up, and I think they'll both be hanging on, but if one of those teams gets hot, they can stay in it. And I think it's going to be real interesting. And Adam Wainwright yesterday for the Cardinals did something that we're not seeing in the game, certainly the last week or two, and that is a starter being old school and going into the 9th inning, which leads us to the topic. I'm looking at box scores every day, looking at games. We're getting 8, 9, 10 pitchers a night all over baseball. What is going on?
Yeah, I mean, just real quick on Wainwright, it's unbelievable. Even having followed the Cardinals and watching most of his starts this year, I was looking at something else yesterday for another pitcher, and even before yesterday's start, I was shocked, even knowing that he's going deep into games, that Wainwright was third in the majors in innings before yesterday's near complete game. So, I mean, it's just unbelievable. Even, like I said, knowing that he takes the ball and he's been a stopper, he's won so many games after losses, stopped losing streaks, helped the bullpen, et cetera, et cetera. But just the bulk innings, I mean, pretty impressive for a guy at his age. But yeah, Rammer, you're on it. I mean, the pitching usage around the league has been pretty unbelievable. I think people expected it after the COVID season, and obviously COVID still being a factor with guys being shuttled off and on and off the injured list has messed with bullpens and rotations and whatnot, and that's led to some of it too. But all that being said, you just look at the pitcher usage, exactly half the teams, 15 of 30, have already, with a few weeks left in the season, set a franchise record for most pitchers used. Now, some of those teams are what you'd expect. It's the Arizonas of the world. It's the Cubs. It's, Baltimore. It's these teams that are searching for any kind of answers for the future, or even just trying to make it through a series in the season. But it's also a lot of the contenders. And I think it's pretty interesting when you look at those teams. The Cardinals are one of them, by the way. They're not that far ahead of their record. I think they're one ahead of their previous high. But, you look at some of these teams that are really up there in terms of the number of pitchers that they've used, and there is a common denominator between Houston and Boston and the Dodgers, and there's a handful of others, that 5 or 6 teams that all are run, Milwaukee's one of them, all run by general managers that come from Tampa, where they've always had this approach of we're not going to have necessarily 2 or 3 horses at the top of the rotation or some shutdown closer and a setup guy. We're going to have a pitching staff, or sometimes 2 full pitching staffs that shuttle in and out throughout the season. So the teams that have been prepared to use that kind of approach, and I think Milwaukee has really done it better than just about anybody. That's the formula you want. I mean, obviously, if you can have the Dodgers pitching staff with, Cy Young top to bottom, you're going to take that. But the rotation pieces that Milwaukee has for the short series in the postseason, the 2 big pieces at the back end, and then just a cavalcade of guys that can be moved around and fill different roles. That's sort of the in vogue model this year. And you talk about that pitch usage that you brought up and how many pitchers are being shuttled in and out. I think those teams that kind of took that Tampa approach coming into the year that, hey, we can set our 26-man roster for opening day, but we better have twice as many pitchers as we start the season with to get through this thing effectively. Not to mention the depth pieces that you need along the way as injuries come up or whatever extenuating circumstances with the pandemic or whatnot come up, those spot starters, those spot relievers. You need guys that might not start the season on your roster that could be impact pieces in the postseason. And that's kind of the way that pitching has trended the last couple of years. And I think that the teams that were prepared to attack it that way coming off of the COVID year have been well served.
That is amazing stuff, and we'll see how it goes in the rest of September, and when the winners get into October, how much they use that formula when it's on the line. That'll be interesting too. Let's talk about, before we run out of time, let's talk about the Hall of Fame ceremony yesterday. It was terrific, I thought, in broad terms, really terrific. If I may begin,
sure,
because I was a young fan when Marvin Miller made his mark on Major League Baseball. And I'll be honest, as a kid, I didn't like him. Why? Because they weren't playing games and they were talking about strikes all the time. And but then as I got older and understood what was at stake and learned about it, I just don't know how you can't admire Marvin Miller, not just with baseball, his whole career, and then him actually be willing to take on in its infancy, a player union and making it strong for its members. Just really an amazing career and an impact on an industry.
Yeah, I totally agree. And you listen to the speech that Don Fear gave yesterday. There were obviously some fans that still had the young Rammer approach at certain points of his speech. You heard a couple boos and some groveling at certain times. But that being said, it is kind of amazing, even if you have a general sense of the history of how free agencies worked in sports and, the MLBPA's place in not just, sports unions, but their status as a union in this country as a whole, you have a decent sense. But some of those numbers that Fear threw out yesterday really bring it home. I mean, the idea that, I get it, different times, inflation, et cetera, insert your factors here. But the idea that the average salary was $6,000, not that long ago, and it was clear from the speech he was making and anything you've read about that kind of struggle that Miller led, the players just had absolutely no concept of how much leverage they had. I mean, this seems like basic stuff now. If you've taken any kind of high school level economics course, let alone led one of the most powerful unions in the country. But they just didn't have any kind of sense. And the owners had them under their thumb for so long that it was just, it can't be overstated, Marvin Miller's importance in the game. And I think that came through yesterday in the speech.
Yeah, and the other two guys, both with Cardinal ties, one of the highlights of my career, broadcasting the Cardinals game when the Cardinals traded for Larry Walker from the Colorado Rockies. He'd always been one of my favorites. Just loved the guy going back to his Montreal days. And we, in the radio booth, we inadvertently got the information before we were supposed to. So I was able to blurt it out on the air ahead of time. And I was thrilled to do so. I was like a little kid, opening up your baseball card pack. Larry Walker. And that was really fun. What a tremendous player. And I'm glad that it wasn't 20 years ago. He might not have ever gotten in. But with analytics and the way things have changed, players like Larry Walker are getting into the Hall of Fame, and it's good for the Hall and good for baseball.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's kind of interesting. You just think about some of the Cardinals Rockies connections over the years. I don't think Matt Holliday is going to have a real chance at Cooperstown, but Nolan Arenado is probably going to be in that conversation when his time comes to an end. And it was touched on a decent amount yesterday in the coverage, just kind of the evolution of thought about how we approach Coors Field. Like, did it help Larry Walker? Clearly it helped Larry Walker. It helps playing a mile above sea level with a massive outfield, obviously. But we just have a better understanding, and we talked about this with Arenado early in the year a little bit, just a better understanding of how difficult Coors Field makes it when you leave Denver. I mean, the difference in seeing pitches and all the things that Cardinals fans have heard all year that are obviously true in relation to Arenado were true for all those Coors Field players. So it's nice to see that wall kind of broken down for the Rockies. I'm not saying they have a long line of players that are worthy or waiting to get in, but they were the only team in the league that had never had a future Hall of Famer play for them at any point in their franchise's history until Walker got in. Not even anybody with a cup of coffee at the end of their career. So nice for the Rockies fans to have a Hall of Famer that they can point to, and kind of an interesting thing to keep an eye on going forward as guys like Helton come up with a more real chance as this balance clears up. And then for a Cardinals connection down the road, obviously Arenado will have that working in his favor when his time comes.
Former Cardinal, Brewers, and Braves catcher Ted Simmons goes in. Terrific speech, tying in with Marvin Miller, which I thought was really special. You could really tell the appreciation of the second chance he got with what I still call the Veterans Committee to get in.
Yeah, I agree. And I think Simmons has been a pretty neat thing to watch. I mean, even growing up a huge baseball fan that had the history of the game taught to me from the time I could walk and talk, and had been around the Cardinals and a Cardinals fan, I didn't have a great appreciation for Simmons. I knew who he was. I knew he was a great player. I knew in more recent years there was kind of a cultish support for his Hall of Fame candidacy. But he just kind of seemed like a guy that got lost in the shuffle. And again, another thing that was cited on the coverage often, it's kind of a Tim Raines, Ricky Henderson situation. When you play in the shadow of Johnny Bench for your tenure in the National League, you can kind of see how you might get lost in the shuffle. Or even if you're appreciated, the gap between greatest catcher of all time and other Hall of Fame caliber catchers is so wide that you can understand how he might have gotten overshadowed. But it's been nice to see, for me personally, just as a fan, to get to know about him. But it seems like in the baseball world, and even with general kind of your average fan, there's been this sort of awakening and understanding to Ted Simmons' place in the game over the last couple of years as he's gotten closer and then eventually got in. And I thought that you said it. I thought his speech yesterday was great. It seemed like everyone really appreciated it, and it wasn't exactly the same kind of speech you typically get in those settings, which I think people appreciated too. It was genuine. It was well delivered. And it's just been a joy to kind of get to know and appreciate what his career has been about these last couple of years. And it's nice when the person matches up with the player too. Finally,
I'm gonna just hand it off to you. Come up with what some people would say is an outrageous statement as I lead into you, and maybe we can debate it on another day. Derek Jeter, for me, if I'm picking my all-time team, Derek Jeter is my shortstop. Go.
Yeah, I mean, there's people that the same type of people that are going to try and tell you that Yadier Molina is a borderline or not a Hall of Famer, probably going to rip their hair out at that. They're going to tell you about his defensive range late in his career. They're going to cite all kinds of metrics that somehow he was able to overcome to make the postseason 16 times and win 5 World Series and always be at the center of winning and never play games where his team was out of contention. Somehow he was able to overcome all of these numbers that tell you he actually wasn't that good, to do nothing but win throughout his whole career. So I'm with you, and I think it's kind of that idea we brought up about your guy Crawford a couple weeks ago. It's definitely true of Jeter. Was he Ozzie Smith in terms of ranging up the middle or making some of the acrobatic plays? No, he wasn't. But was there a shortstop that you'd want the ball hit to with 2 outs in the ninth in Game 7 of the World Series more than Derek Jeter? No, there wasn't. Does that make him an elite defensive shortstop? Maybe not. But he did what he did so well and so consistently for so long that I don't know how you could really argue with your choice of him as your all-time shortstop. There was just such a high floor of the production you were going to get from him and such a metronome-like aspect to his career. And it was talked about a lot on the broadcast yesterday. I mean, basically a whole season's worth of games in the postseason.
Yeah.
His postseason numbers are better slightly than his regular season numbers. That is impressive stuff right there. And it kind of speaks to what he's all about, just in terms of turning in that same kind of effort, not just day to day, but year to year over a long, long, long period of time.
Yeah. And somebody mentioned him and Ruth and Gehrig, and he belongs with those guys. Their offensive numbers maybe overshadow, of course, but 3,400 hits in a winter.
Yeah.
See, that's what the Yankees are all about. You can be a great player, but if you're not in the World Series almost every year and winning most of those series, you're a step behind that pantheon of great Yankees. That's the standard for the New York Yankees, winning world championships.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. That has to be right up at the top, and he's got 5 of them. And like I said, those 16 appearances in it basically every single year. And by the way, people like to act like the bulk of his resume was built in the late 90s and early 2000s. And obviously those were the high points of his career in terms of winning titles. But go back and look at his Baseball Reference page. He put together, did he have some down years late in his career? Yeah, he did. But he put together not nice years. He put together some monster years offensively towards the end of his career. I think second or third to last season in the league, he led the majors in hits, had some years where he hit way over, I'm not talking 305, 310, like 330 batting averages late into his career. And people look at, I love the numbers too, but as the sort of analytics age took over and it was an OPS world and everything was about power and getting on base, people, scoffed at batting average. Is it nice to have a David Ortiz with a 400 on base percentage, 600 slugging percentage? Sure. But it's not like hitting 335 with not a lot of walks and not a ton of homers and doubles and singles all over the place is a bad thing either. And Derek Jeter was doing that basically his whole career.
Truly, truly marvelous. So this weekend, the Subway Series, tell me about what's coming up on MLB Network.
Yeah, Subway Series, and then we just kind of stay flexible these last couple of weeks of the season. Don't try and put too much in concrete on the schedule so we can kind of adjust and follow these races as they play out. So Subway Series is one you can definitely put on the books for tomorrow night, and we'll have a couple of those games over the weekend as well. And then rest of the season, just kind of hang on and follow these pennant races, and we'll have MLB Tonight and some past 3 games and live games and the whole gamut. If it's relevant to the pennant race, you can probably find it in one form or another on MLB Network.
Well, next week when we reconvene, it'll be interesting. My guess is there might not be a lot of changes. There might be. Somebody could skyrocket and somebody drop off. The likelihood is it's just a grind of a mess and everybody's scrambling to survive. We'll find out next week.
If we've learned anything here, the only guarantee is the Mariners will somehow still be in the thick of it. That tells you how upside down the world is.
Keith, great to talk to you. Have a great weekend, and we'll talk to you next week. That's Keith Costas. I'm Bob Ramsey on the